Rainbow Family Life Stories by Jodey Bateman. Interviews with Rainbow Family of Living Light folks conducted between 1977 and 2008. Scanned in 2018. Jodey Bateman may be contacted on Facebook. 16.A.Jodey.LifeStory1, My Life, one of two. Jodey spent over 3 decades documenting the life stories of dozens of Rainbow Family folks. After scanning all these, I pointed out to him that he never wrote his own life story. So in early 2019, Jodey did just that. Please enjoy the life story of Jodey Bateman, Henry the Fiddler. My Life, Part 1, Jodey Bateman. At the beginning of the 1960s, my story might have sounded bizarre. By 1970, my story was usual for many of my generation. When I was a child and a teenager, the world seemed like it was going to stay the same way forever. Since then, there seemed to have been a series of revolutions. I was born in Duncan, Oklahoma on February 8, 1942. I have 2 brothers, Jack, born in 1946, and Jim, born in 1948. On both my father and mother's side, I had ancestors who were slave owners. Some of them were in the Confederate Army. These facts may be of some interest when I get further on in my story. In 1947, my father started working for the Halliburton Oil Well Cementing Company. They cement the casings around the drilling shaft so that the person who is drilling cannot be accused of drilling into someone else's oil-bearing sand. In those days, the company was owned by its founder, Earl P. Halliburton, who had started out as an ordinary oil field worker in the Velma oil field. That was the largest oil field in Oklahoma, 15 miles east of Duncan, where I was born. We called Mr. Halliburton Uncle Earl. After he died in 1958, the company's headquarters moved to Dallas. Still later, Halliburton's headquarters were moved to Dubai in the Middle East. By that time, the CEO of Halliburton's was Dick Cheney, who later became vice president of the USA. Halliburton's machine shop remained in Duncan, at one time the largest non-union machine shop in the USA. When I was 5 years old, I was taken to see the machine shop where I later worked at age 19 as a machinist's helper in the summer of 1961 to make money to go to college. My father started out working in the machine shop. Since Uncle Earl Halliburton had started out as a blue-collar worker in the oil fields, he expected all his male employees to start out at the blue-collar jobs so they would know how to do them in case of an emergency. But my father had 3 years of college, so he went on to a white-collar job as a materials parts coordinator. He had to know where every piece of Halliburton equipment was at a large number of oil fields. He had an amazing memory. His job is probably done now by a computer. I was born premature. This means that I was slow and awkward compared to the other kids. I could not walk until I was 2 years old. Our family doctor told my parents that I would have normal coordination by the time I was 40. My mother never told me this until I was over 30 years old. I never got completely normally coordinated, but all the physical activity in Rainbow helped me to improve greatly while I was in my 30s. A couple in Rainbow examined my back and said that some of the muscles were well developed while others were very poorly developed. This uneven development has caused me problems. I used to complain about it when I was younger, but now that I am 76, I find I have very little to complain about compared to other people my age. Basically, I have a strong, sturdy frame and vigorous health. I never have to go to the doctor. I inherited this health from 2 great-grandmothers. My father's grandmother, who we called Dada, lived in Little Rock, Arkansas. She was born in 1862 and died in 1958, at age 96 when I was 16. My mother's grandmother, who we called Granny, was born in 1872 and died at age 87 in 1959 when I was 17. When I was a teenager, when school was over, I would walk to my grandmother's house, which was closer to the school than my parents' house. My grandmother was often not there because she had many church and community activities, but Granny was there. She would fix me cornbread and navy beans. I had always disliked these foods, but I came to like them when Granny would cook them for me. Granny was an extremely intelligent person with very sharp perceptions. I could not imagine anybody hiding anything from her. I knew vaguely that there was some sort of tension between my parents, and that my father was often angry with me and my brother Jack. Granny guessed more than I knew about my own life. She complained to my grandmother that my father had intimidated me. My grandmother didn't tell me this until I was over 30. Granny never told me. She had tried once to intervene on behalf of one of her grandsons. She felt that his other grandmother was mistreating him. But Granny's intervention only made matters worse, so she never did such a thing again. From when my brothers and I were very small, we were constantly over at our grandparents' house. My grandfather died when I was 12. Our grandparents were strongly religious people who made sure that we went to church. I was fascinated with the Bible stories of these interesting ancient Middle Eastern people, who were somehow the same as Myers Auschwitz and Sid Aronson, who owned stores in Duncan. My grandparents, and less often my parents, went to the Disciples of Christ Church, called the Christian Church. It was founded by Alexander Campbell, a contemporary of Thomas Jefferson, and was run in a very democratic way, a very warm, neighborly place. The Disciples' Church is strongest in the border country between North and South, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas. In 1960, I graduated from high school and went to Westminster College, now Westminster University, in Fulton, Missouri. It was run by the Presbyterian Church. At this time, I was learning how to play a guitar and sing the folk songs that were so popular then. At the Easter vacation of spring 1961, my mother's sister Anna Nell Stott and her husband Monty Stott picked me up at Westminster and took me to Chicago. They gave me some money to buy a book at Brentano's bookstore. I bought Alan Lomax's The Folk Songs of North America, a collection of songs with notes on their backgrounds. This book became an influence on my life. My aunt and uncle were not with me. I walked out of the bookstore and into the first demonstration I had ever seen in my life. It was to welcome the peace walkers who were walking from San Francisco to Moscow to call for the nations which had nuclear weapons to get rid of them. I went with the demonstration to an auditorium in a hotel. A.J. Musty gave a speech. He was 76 years old, one of the best-known American pacifists, a friend of the parents of Garrick Beck. I met two of the peace walkers, Jerry Lehman and Regina Fisher. She was the mother of Bobby Fischer, who later became a chess champion. Jerry and Regina put me on a mailing list, and when I got back to college, I started receiving pacifist and left-wing literature. But before I returned to college, another big development happened. My aunt and uncle took me to St. Louis, where we stayed in a hotel. While we were there, my mother telephoned us and told us she was divorcing my father. My aunt and uncle were stunned. I was surprised, but less than they were. I knew my father's anger very well. He gave a lot of psychological abuse, but physical abuse was very rare. And I know now that when he was in a good mood, he did not realize how intense his spells of anger were and how they affected us. My aunt had known my father before my mother did. She had never seen any of this anger. To my aunt, as to everybody outside his household, my father was a quiet, soft-spoken man. Until I was 38 years old and my father and brother both joined Alcoholics Anonymous, I had never known that my father was an alcoholic. He had never behaved like a stereotyped drunk. My mother did me the biggest favor anybody ever did in my life by divorcing my father. He would never have allowed the course that my life took, and I would probably have had a breakdown if my mother had stayed with my father. In the fall of 1961, I started my sophomore year at Oklahoma University in Norman. I loved the great American writers, especially John Steinbeck and William Saroyan, and I wanted to be a writer myself. I had heard that writers started out as reporters, so I majored in journalism. The only class I had trouble with at Oklahoma University was ROTC, which was compulsory for males. I flunked my second semester of ROTC. I didn't want to repeat ROTC again. I went to college that summer and fall and then dropped out and went to Chicago. I became in effect a refugee at the National Office of the Student Peace Union, an organization I had joined in 1961, from contact with them through the peace movement literature I started receiving after the demonstration in Chicago. I found that most of the people who worked at the Student Peace Union National Office were in the strongly anti-communist Young People's Socialist League. From that point on, I knew I was some kind of socialist. I went from Chicago to Fulton, Missouri, and hung out at Westminster College, where I had spent my freshman year. From there, I decided to hitch to California. I got picked up by the police in Columbia, Missouri, about 25 miles west of Fulton. My father came and got me out of jail and drove me back to Duncan. Then I went up to Norman to enroll in Oklahoma University again. While I was there, I met up with Roger Corkins and Paul Fox, two old friends. They were with Jim Russell, who I am in touch with on Facebook now. They were going to start an Oklahoma University chapter of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. I had first heard of SDS in 1961 from a magazine called The Activist, which was for sale at a bookstore near the Oklahoma University campus. It was also the first time I ever saw the word activist. On May Day of 1963, we organized this chapter of SDS at the apartment of Nina Flannery. I am still in touch with her on Facebook. That summer of 1963, I sang in a coffee house called the Bad-Eyed Cat in Norman. In the fall, my brother Jack, who was 16, joined SDS. He started spending 3 days a week drunk at high school, 2 days hitchhiking around Oklahoma to clear his head, and 2 days with me in my dorm room. Finally, he dropped out of school. My mother had me rent, for only $50 a month, the entire third floor of a rooming house in Norman, where my brother Jack and I could stay. My mother wanted me to get him into the University High School in Norman, where a lot of the students were children of professors. That never happened. Instead, my brother went back to Duncan in the fall of 1964 and did 2 semesters in one and graduated from high school in December 1964. People have asked about my interest in languages. The spring of 1964, when my brother Jack stayed with me, I had a course in descriptive linguistics from Drive. William Biddle, a remarkable scholar who did the first major study of the Plains Apache language from some of the last few speakers. I did some research on my own with a speaker of Caddo, which is an endangered Native American language of southwestern Oklahoma. I learned only the bare beginnings of that language, but it was fascinating. At the beginning of the spring of 1964, I filled out an application to join the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project and was accepted. This project was sponsored by COFU, the Council of Federated Organizations, a coalition of civil rights organizations. Most of the staff were from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. My brother Jack hitched with me as far as Atoka, Oklahoma. I hitched on to Monroe, Louisiana, and took the bus from there to Jackson, Mississippi, where the COFU headquarters was. From Jackson, Larry Rubin, a white civil rights worker, took me in his car to Holly Springs, Mississippi, to Rust, an all-black Methodist college where we worked with others on the Freedom Libraries project. People from all over the country were sending books to Rust. We sorted out the best ones and took them in a truck to set up freedom libraries for people in black communities in various towns throughout the Delta, a large triangle of almost perfectly flat land that formed the northwestern corner of Mississippi. Then we took the bus up to Western College for Women at Oxford, Ohio. The college was letting the civil rights movement use its buildings during the summer for orientation sessions to train volunteers for the Mississippi Project. While I was there, my father phoned and said if I went down to Mississippi, he would come and get me with some Oklahomans who really know how to integrate. The staff people thought it would be too dangerous for security if I went down to Mississippi at that time. Already, 3 civil rights workers had left the orientation sessions where we were in Ohio and gone down to Mississippi and disappeared. They were James Chaney, who was black, and Mickey Schwerner and Andy Goodman, who were white. We were sure they were dead. Their bodies were found almost 2 months later. I got a ride with a carload of volunteers who were on their way to Mississippi. They let me and another person out in Kentucky in the middle of the night. We hitched to Hazard, Kentucky, where we heard that SDS people were working with the roving pickets movement, the coal miners of the area who had been abandoned by their union but were still picketing at coal mines that they knew were unsafe. When we got to Hazard, we found out that the SDS people had been arrested and forced to leave town. I hitched to Louisville to see Carl and Ann Braden, who were the center of left-wing activity in that city. They arranged for me to stay at the local ERAP project of SDS. ERAP stands for Economic Research and Action Project. While almost 1,000 young people were in Mississippi for freedom, summer about 150 SDS members were working with ERAP in poverty neighborhoods, both black and white. The SDS members who had been arrested and run out of Hazard, Kentucky, were the ERAP project there. ERAP served as a mode for the U.S. government's Volunteers in Service to America, VISTA. I lived in a house on 9th Street Alley with the Louisville ERAP people. One end of the alley was a black slum, the other end was a poor white slum. Carl and Ann Braden phoned up Tom Hayden in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Hayden had set up the ERAP projects. He had me come up to Ann Arbor and work in the national office of ERAP, which was on the University of Michigan campus. One of our main jobs was to print as many copies as possible of the prospectus for each of the various ERAP projects. This was done on an electric mimeograph machine, which can be a lot harder to use than a computer. A lot of these copies were to be taken to the convention of the National Student Association, an organization of student governments of colleges with about 3 million students in all. In August 1964, the leading staff members of ERAP were going to the National Student Association convention. I hitched to New York City in August to work in the local office of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. At night after the office was closed, I usually lived on the subway from Union Square to Jamaica and back again to Union Square. Sometimes I stayed at the homes of people who worked at the SNCC office. Finally, the whole New York SNCC office, including me, went on a bus down to Atlantic City, New Jersey, to picket the Democratic National Convention. This picketing was to support the delegation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP. They were an integrated delegation of 84 people, 80 blacks and 4 whites, including a former Klansman. They wanted to replace the all-white regular Democratic delegation from Mississippi. The regular delegation walked out rather than swear to support Lyndon Johnson, the Democrat, for president. Many of them were going to campaign for Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate. But Johnson would not agree to put in their place the integrated MFDP delegation, which had been put together by the civil rights movement. Those of us from the New York SNCC office were on the boardwalk between the convention hall and the ocean. Sometimes some of us would be taken to a black church to sleep for 2 hours, but there had to be people on the boardwalk picketing at all times. I saw 2 enraged men shouting at the delegates from other states because they would not defy President Johnson and let the MFDP in. One of the enraged men was Bob Williams, the former Klansman, a shrimp fisherman from Biloxi, Mississippi. All the family of Bob Williams were in the Klan. When he left the Klan to join the civil rights movement, his family cut him off. Every day after that, he rode out on his motorcycle with a black friend sitting behind him. Every day his former associates in the Klan would pull him and his black friend off the motorcycle and beat them up. Finally, after several days of this, the Klansmen were willing to listen to what Bob Williams had to say about the civil rights movement. The other enraged person was a tall, slender black man named Stokely Carmichael. He was the director of the Mississippi Summer Project for the 2nd Congressional District, which included the Delta, the northwest region of the state. Stokely shouted at the delegates who were going along with President Johnson in excluding the MFDP delegation. He spoke of the all-white Mississippi delegation which had walked out rather than support Johnson. Those segregationists have more integrity than you do. I went up to Stokely and asked if I could possibly work in a project in the 2nd District where he was director. He said yes. After the convention, I hitched from Atlantic City to Holly Springs, Mississippi, which was in the 2nd Congressional District. There I met once more with Larry Rubin, who I had worked with on Freedom Libraries. Two whites who had worked with us on Freedom Libraries, Pete Brett and Steve Sokoloff, gave me a ride to Clarksdale, a large town on the western edge of the Central Delta, near the Mississippi River. In Clarksdale, in front of the Civil Rights Office, I met two white civil rights workers, Dave Bradshaw and Dick Moore. They said they were the last civil rights workers in Marks, a town 17 miles east of Clarksdale. They said the place was bad. I said I would like to go take their place. They took me that night to a mass meeting of the black community of Marks at Eudora Methodist Church. Then we went home with Reverend G.W. Ward, a black Baptist minister, and his wife, Mrs. Sarah Ward. My Life, Part 2. Jodey Bateman. The next morning, Dave Bradshaw and Dick Moore, the two white civil rights workers, got in their car and headed north. A few days later, the new director for the local project in Marks arrived, Alan Goodner, a young black man aged 19. Soon there was also Sam Jackson, a young black man from New York City. But I had a strange role. The county attorney, who was white, like almost all officials in Mississippi, had told the black people that all the civil rights workers would be gone. Then all the blacks who had been active in the civil rights movement would be prosecuted on various charges which the county attorney would think up, as some were already being prosecuted, and there would be no civil rights workers with contacts outside the county to help them. I regret saying this, but many people in that little town, both black and white, identified civil rights worker as white civil rights worker. As unfortunate as this may be, still I, a 22-year-old white, was a symbol to the people of Marks that the civil rights movement had not abandoned the black community. There were only a few other whites who came to Marks that fall to work with the civil rights movement, and they stayed only a week or two. One of them was the 18-year-old David Harris, who later married the folk singer Joan Baez. Most of the time I lived in an all-black world, in the homes of black people in a rural county seat town of about 3,000 people, half of them black. This all-black world was more common among the relatively few civil rights workers who were in the state in the fall and winter. The volunteers for the summer project usually stayed in buildings rented from blacks called freedom houses. While they faced danger often and went from door to door to get to know local blacks, they spent their nights among other whites, usually college-educated. They also spent a lot of time around black civil rights staff people, who were usually college-educated and sophisticated in the ways of the nationwide white culture. But those of us in rural areas who were there after Freedom Summer were around people who were still healthy and vigorous, who in their youth had plowed with mules and directed teams of oxen in hauling logs. I was in Quitman County, the county with the lowest median income for blacks in Mississippi, and the lowest level of education for blacks. Half of blacks over age 25 in the country had not finished grade school. These people had much knowledge to give the world, and there was no one around from the civil rights movement who was prepared to learn that knowledge from them. Certainly I wasn't prepared. I could only absorb the general spirit of that knowledge. I visited over half the black homes in Marks. At first, I went around with a young black man named J.D. Powells, age 19. He was related by blood or marriage to a large part of the black community of Marks, and he knew most of the others. He told me, "If you say something in those big college words, I'll break it down where they can understand it." Actually, J.D. often repeated exactly what I said. The truth was that many blacks had gotten where they would not hear whites, since whites usually had no good to say to them. Blacks had to hear something from another black person before they would pay attention or believe it. After a while, the barriers between me and a lot of the black people of Marks had broken down. I was getting invitations to birthday parties and Christmas dinners. There were a lot of incidents. I went to jail for 8 days for going with some black teenagers to try to integrate the all-white school. Alan Goodner, the project director, was playing cards with some other young black men. They had some money on the table to go buy bread and bologna to make sandwiches when their card game was over. A deputy sheriff came in and arrested Allen and some of the others for operating a gambling house. It took a while to get money to bail Allen and the others out. Then the money was taken by the county authorities for another bogus charge, destroying mattresses in the jail. Every one of the black youths but Allen was put back in jail. One of those who was returned to jail was J.D. Powells, the young black man who had accompanied me from door to door to get to know the black people of Marks. As he said later, they charged all of us but Allen Goodner. They knew he could bring in lawyers from the outside. Allen did bring in 2 civil rights lawyers who got the other black youths out of jail. The food was not good in the jail. The canned corn often had bits of ice in it from being in the refrigerator too long. Allen got ill on the inedible diet. I have also seen this happen to white jail prisoners in Oklahoma. Finally, Allen had to leave, which was the object of the county attorney who brought the bogus charges. Our new project director was R.T. Smith, a young black man from the nearby large town of Clarksdale. My Life, Part 3, Jodey Bateman. I have written a book which is in the process of being published, which goes into all the incidents of those times in detail. But what was important for me, in many ways the turning point of my whole life, was meeting up with the Franklin family. It began while Allen Goodner was still in Marks. First, Jesse James Franklin, who was age 46, came by the Black Masonic Hall where we had our civil rights headquarters. He was one of many people who came to me with papers, the documents the modern world showered down on them from lawyers, welfare, county government, insurance companies, car dealers, loan agencies, etc. Jesse Franklin, like the others, wanted me to explain what such a document meant in clear words. He had never been to school and was illiterate. His document was a form to be filled out for workmen's compensation. He had been shoveling dirt to build a levee on the Coldwater River at Darling, north of Marks. He slipped in the mud and injured his spine. I filled out the form for him as a matter of course and never realized what would come of it. When his $5,000 workman's compensation came, which would be $20,000 in present-day values, Jesse Franklin used the money for the next year or two to help bail people out of jail who were there on civil rights charges. For a long time he paid for gas so civil rights workers could visit black people in remote rural areas of the county. The other 2 Franklin brothers were Jack Franklin, age 64, and William Franklin, age 54. I met them on a rainy day when I was canvassing, going from door to door on Cotton Street. All 3 Franklin brothers live in the Cotton Street neighborhood, which was kept out of the city limits of Marks so that the city didn't provide them with paved streets or running water. The civil rights workers who had been in Marks during the previous summer didn't have much contact with the Franklins. The Franklin brothers didn't say much at the big mass meetings. They usually hung around the doorway to see if the cops or other whites might come by and harass the meetings. Then a chain of events happened that involved me more than ever with the Franklin family. A lot of black kids in Marks had only worn out second-hand clothes. Some of the other kids in school and some of the teachers would make fun of the way they looked. So their parents would keep them home, or often out picking cotton, until they could afford to buy nice enough clothes to go to school in. For several years, the Civil Rights Office in Clarksdale had been getting shipments of clothing from donors up north. Then, after the summer, volunteers went back and talked about the needs of Mississippi. People who heard them started sending even more clothes to civil rights offices in larger towns like Clarksdale. The demand for these clothes was tremendous. In a small place like Marks, civil rights leaders were expected by their supporters to go to the large towns and bring back clothes. "All that fuss about them rags," William Franklin used to say. "They ain't going after the important thing, and that's the freedom." In Marks, the clothes were brought back by Reverend Panola B. Carter. He had a church on the first floor of the 2-story Black Masonic Hall. We used his church for civil rights meetings. Reverend Carter was constantly accused of having favorites that he gave most of the clothes to. He was always trying new ways of giving the clothes out and making sure everyone had a fair share, but there were never enough clothes. There were always rumors that someone who didn't need the clothes had gotten them and sold them to sharecroppers out on the plantations. The more the clothing rumors spread against Reverend Carter, the more he spoke warmly on his favorite theme at civil rights meetings. That meeting ought to pay him for damage to the bathroom he had built onto the Masonic Hall. A teenage boy and girl had gone into the bathroom at night and had sexual relations on the sink. This damaged the pipes so that the toilet and the shower were useless. Finally, the last straw for Reverend Carter came when black entertainer Dick Gregory sent thousands of Christmas turkeys to Mississippi for the civil rights projects to distribute. In Marks, the Christmas turkeys were a disaster. There just weren't possibly enough turkeys for all the black people. Rumors about sales of gift turkeys reached a high pitch. When Reverend Carter was giving out the turkeys, a few people fought over them and pulled them back and forth. Reverend Carter pulled out a pistol and told some people to move back. People who came late got only half a turkey for their families. Some who came late got none. One black community leader who came out of this whole hassle looking well was Reverend G.W. Ward. I went with him when he gave most of his turkey to a very poor woman and her children who lived out on a plantation. At that time, Alan Goodner, the project director, was still living in Marks. Reverend Carter, who was in a worse mood than ever, told me and Alan that we had to leave the Masonic Hall, which was also his church. He told us not to take any of our stuff with us: books from the Freedom Library, documents, the typewriter, first aid equipment. Reverend Carter probably wanted to sort through our stuff to see if there was anything he could sell so he could pay for damages to his bathroom. But Alan and I loaded the best of the books with the documents onto William Franklin's battered old flatbed truck. Mr. Franklin took this stuff and stored it in his house. When Reverend Carter found out, he called the sheriff to have us arrested for breaking and entering the Masonic Hall. Alan and I hid out for 2 days with local black people. Then Alan and I called Stokely Carmichael, who was in charge of all the civil rights projects for our congressional district. He stayed in the large town of Greenwood. Stokely phoned the Civil Rights Office in Jackson, the state capital, to pay for the damages to Reverend Carter's bathroom. Reverend Carter dropped charges against us. Alan, whose health had been bad ever since he had been in jail, went down to Jackson. I moved in with William Franklin's family because that was where all the things were from our office. William Franklin was helping the civil rights movement in Marks stay alive when it looked like it might die out. As William Franklin told me, the sheriff told me I was gone crazy doing it. He begged me not to do it. He told me, "Franklin, that stuff ain't nothing but that old comicism. I wish you wouldn't get into it." I told him, "Man, I lived under y'all's rule all of my life, and I guess I can live under what these people got." William Franklin and his wife had 2 grown daughters up north, Elnora and Lenora. The oldest at home was May Ella, who was 16. Then came Presley, 14, Melvin, 12, Hull, 9, Ruby Lee, 7, and Jimmy Lee, 4. Mr. Franklin got jobs tearing down deserted shacks out on the plantations where people who had moved north had lived. Then he would haul the lumber from these shacks into town to build new shacks. Mrs. Henrietta Franklin, the wife of William Franklin, had been with the Jobs Committee that was set up when the civil rights workers had come in the summer of 1964. She and the other black women on the committee had asked repeatedly for work in a small textile mill that had been set up recently in the town of Lambert, 3 miles south of Marks. Mrs. Franklin had a list of the women who had tried to get jobs. So far, the only black women who had gotten jobs there were a couple of cleaning women, while white women were being hired from as far as 40 miles away to work the machines. William Franklin and his brother Jesse frequently hauled firewood or government commodity food for people in the neighborhood who had no way of picking up these things for themselves. William Franklin had only 1 year of school and his wife had 3 years, but their children were among the best students in the black school. They were able to take good advantage of the books we had brought from the Masonic Hall, and so were some other black kids from the Cotton Street neighborhood who were able to read well. For me, one of the most important things about the Franklin family was that for the first time in my life, I was living with a family that was really happy and stable, in spite of their tremendous difficulties. I was 22 years old at the time. There are many other events that happened around the end of 1964 and early 1965, but the only ones I have time to discuss are these. After Alan Goodner left, our new project director, a young black man named R.T. Smith, came to Marks from Clarksdale. At the beginning of March 1965, R.T. Smith and a white civil rights worker named John Siegel and I were arrested. We had gone with a group of black teenagers to try to integrate a restaurant in downtown Marks. The Civil Rights Act, which supposedly integrated restaurants, had already been passed several months before. This was during the actions around voting rights in Selma, Alabama. About 1,000 people, mostly black, were in jail around the state of Mississippi because they took part in actions in support of Selma. R.T. Smith and John Siegel got out of jail before I did. I was in jail for 10 days. Two friends in Oklahoma, Jeannie Pickering and Louis Hamilton, raised money to get me out of jail. Together with money from my mother and grandmother, they bailed me out of jail. A reporter for the Daily Oklahoman, the big newspaper in Oklahoma City, came to Marks for when I got out of jail. He took me back to Oklahoma City on a plane. I enrolled again in Oklahoma University for the summer courses. Once more I rented an apartment with my brother Jack in Norman, the university town. Jack had graduated from high school at the end of 1964. He enrolled in Oklahoma University at the beginning of 1965, but the university told him that he had to take ROTC. He refused and dropped out of college and hitched to California. When he came back to Norman that spring, he found that ROTC had suddenly been declared no longer compulsory at Oklahoma University. Jack and I took part in demonstrations against the Vietnam War held by the Oklahoma University SDS chapter. Jack had already been to the big national demonstration against the war in April 1965 in Washington, D.C. While I was still in Mississippi, on my 23rd birthday, February 8, 1965, the USA began massive continuous bombing of North Vietnam and sent a large number of troops to South Vietnam. To understand the situation my brother Jack and I and other SDS people were in, remember these things. The dramatic escalation of the Vietnam War took place in the administration of President Lyndon Johnson, the most liberal administration in American history. The majority of liberals were for the war. The majority of college students were for the war, including the majority of the students at Oklahoma University. Those of us who were opposed to the war were isolated from the main currents of American life, so we valued our friendship with one another. I was glad of one thing: at the national demonstration against the war, which my brother Jack attended, one of the speakers was Bob Moses, a black civil rights activist who had been a graduate instructor in math at Harvard. He was the main founder of the Mississippi Civil Rights Projects, which I had taken part in. In his speech at the anti-war demonstration, Bob Moses said, "Negroes don't know much about Vietnam, but we do know one thing about this country by which we will judge everything it says about Vietnam: it lies." Shortly before I started back to the university summer courses, my brother Jack and some friends tried peyote. Then I tried it with some friends. A few days later, two more friends showed up. One of them was from Duncan, our hometown. I had known him since the second grade. These friends pulled out some pot for us to smoke. I didn't like it, but my brother said after the people left, "You smoke it as a matter of courtesy." My brother had first smoked pot in Lawton, Oklahoma, in 1963, when he was 16. In 1963, I had seen people go out a window onto a flat roof to smoke pot, but I had not joined them. I was 21 at the time, but I thought pot might be dangerous. I am trying to get across here that the networks of friendships that became the counterculture were active in Oklahoma as early as 1963. In the summer of 1965, some people in this particular Norman, Oklahoma, scene went to California and brought back some LSD. I bought some from them and took it. My brother Jack had been away working in the SDS national office in Chicago. When he came back, I bought some LSD, and he tried it for the first time. He was 18 at the time. At the end of the summer, Jack and I hitched to Washington, D.C. to a demonstration against the war called the Assembly of Unrepresented People. Among the demonstrators there was A.J. Muste, who I remembered as a speaker from the first demonstration I had attended back in 1961. Now in 1965, he was 80 years old. Another person in the Assembly of Unrepresented People was Bob Moses, the black activist who had founded the Mississippi Project. I was arrested along with over 400 people in the largest mass arrest in Washington, D.C. history until then. My brother Jack was not arrested. He got me bailed out after 2 days. Then we stayed with Francis Galt, an employee of the Library of Congress, who I had known when he was a civil rights worker in Clarksdale, Mississippi. He was white, but his apartment was in the middle of the black part of Washington, D.C. After a couple of weeks, Jack and I hitched to New York City and stayed with Lou Hyde, who had also been a civil rights worker in Mississippi. He was also white, but lived in Spanish Harlem. Lou and my brother and I met with Sis Cunningham and Gordon Friesen, both age 57. They were from Oklahoma and were friends of the great Oklahoma songwriter Woody Guthrie. Sis and Gordon published Broadside, a magazine for songwriters. They were the first to publish songs by Bob Dylan, Phil Ochs, Janis Ian, Nina Simone, and others. They also published a song by Lou Hyde, who went with my brother and me over to their apartment. I had been in touch with Sis and Gordon as sort of a correspondent for their magazine Broadside since 1963. After that, I hitched back to Mississippi while my brother stayed for a while in New York. When I got to Marks, I found out our new project director was Reverend L.C. Coleman from Clarksdale, who was about age 50. I lived with the family of William Franklin again. Mr. Franklin had been very concerned because of threats by the county attorney to put his daughter May Ella, age 17, in reform school for being in the unsuccessful attempt to integrate the restaurant in Marks. To protect his daughter and to integrate the school, Mr. Franklin got in touch with some of the most distinguished civil rights lawyers in the USA, Marion Wright Edelman, a black lawyer, later an associate of Hillary Clinton, Mel Leventhal, who was white but married to the black novelist Alice Walker, and John Doerr, a white Republican, but he was later involved in the investigation of the Nixon administration during Watergate. Mr. Franklin became the main contact in Marks for civil rights lawyers and for the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Justice Department. After the Voting Rights Act was passed and there were no longer literacy tests to keep people from registering to vote, Mr. Franklin and his wife and his brothers registered. Mr. Franklin took truckloads of black people in his old flatbed down to the courthouse to register. In all, he took 500 people to register. Before that, in Quitman County, where Marks was the county seat, only 5% of black adults had been registered to vote. By the fall of 1965, 600 blacks in the county were registered, about 20% of eligible blacks. In December 1965, I went back to Oklahoma to see the dentist. I had lived for a long time in a place without dentists, toothbrushes, bathroom sinks, or bathrooms. I had trenchmouth. My gums were yellow and swollen and aching. After getting my gums and teeth fixed up, I went to Minneapolis to see Francis Galt and other friends who had been civil rights workers. Then I hitched down to Chicago to work in the SDS National Office in January 1966. At the National Office, I saw a report from Austin, Texas, by Jeff Sherrow, the National Vice President of SDS. In the report, which was dated December 1965, Jeff Sherrow spoke of the possibility of a hippie politico blend. That was the first time I had ever seen the word hippie. I found out later from the autobiography of Malcolm X that the word hippie was used in New York City's Harlem as early as 1944. The word hippie then meant white youth who wore zoot suits and hung out with black musicians. Then I found out that my brother Jack had been arrested with 13 others in Norman for possession of marijuana. 3 of those arrested were members of SDS, and the press in Oklahoma was treating the whole thing as almost an official activity of SDS. Back in the national office, Clark Kissinger, the SDS National Secretary, wanted to expel the whole Norman, Oklahoma, SDS chapter. The SDS National Office staff explained to him that they had all smoked pot. Kissinger yelled, "I want a movement for social change, not an alliance of dope rings." But the Norman SDS chapter was not expelled. I got a ride back to Norman with Scott Pittman, an SDS member who was on his way to Austin. In the defense of my brother and the others, who were arrested, 50 faculty members at Oklahoma University signed a statement of support for them. There was another statement of support from a group of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. When the cases finally came before a judge, there turned out to be problems with the warrant. The pot raid was conducted at a rooming house. The arresting officers assumed that their warrant gave them the right to go into any room in the building. They had gone into the room of a student who was not even in the building at the time of the arrests. There was no pot in his room, but the officers seized literature against the war in Vietnam that they found in the room. This literature was announced to the press as some sort of evidence against the people who were arrested for pot. The judge ruled that the warrant did not apply to every individual room in the building and failed to make clear where the search was to take place. Definitely it was illegal to seize the anti-war literature. So the case against my brother and the others was thrown out of court. When I got back to Mississippi, I talked with a civil rights lawyer who told me he had never seen a properly written drug warrant. This is why later in the war on drugs, laws were passed that made it unnecessary to have warrants in most drug cases at all. I got back to Marks, Mississippi on March 9, 1966. There was a new white civil rights worker in Marks, Alec Shimkin, age 21. Alec had been in a demonstration in Natchez, Mississippi in November 1965, where 400 people were arrested. There wasn't enough room in the local jail, so they were taken to the Mississippi State Prison at Parchman. There they were made to stand at attention naked in the November night. When Alec fell out of attention, a guard knocked his upper front teeth out. Another one of the demonstrators was having a nervous breakdown by the time the civil rights lawyers bailed them out of prison. It wasn't safe for Alec to stay in Natchez, so after he saw his parents for Christmas, the Jackson Civil Rights Office sent him to Marks. Alec's father had been a colonel in military intelligence. He quit the military in protest because he knew the escalation of the Vietnam War was being planned in the early summer of 1964, before the incidents that supposedly were the reasons for the escalation. After he left the Army, he became a professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois. Alec Shimkin, with his courage and integrity, was a model of the very best of the 1960s activists. As a result of meeting him, some other incidents happened that would be a major turning point in my life, as I will tell later.